This is Ancient Political Philosophy, Wednesday, November 11th. Happy Veterans Day. And, uh, boy, if I don't look like a mess, well, here, let's straighten up a little bit. There we go. Let's make sure that yarmulke is right on our face there. Good, excellent. Today we're discussing Book 4, and on Friday we'll finish up with the politics with books 5, 7, and 8. I haven't required you to look at book 6, but you might. He weighs the best question, the question of the best way of life, and which is kind of an echo back to the ethics. But you'll see echoes of the ethics. I like that phrase. Echoes of the ethics. Echoes of the ethics. Echoes of the ethics. You'll find echoes of the ethics in books 7 and 8 too. Book 3 is, and book 3 and book 4 really kind of constituted a set. And for part of this discussion, you might want to have this delightful chartograph that I sent out, which has both a kind of an overall rundown of the politics, a kind of a restatement of book 3, and then a kind of a drawing. Oh, you have to do things backwards here. Only a PhD could figure that one out. Which has here, we'll let you look at it very closely, just in case you're watching this and don't have access to my wonderful class materials. This is my schema of book 4, of how, because even though book 4 continues the theme of book 3, kinds of polities, etc., in his elaboration of them, you get a much fuller description of the kinds of democracies, oligarchies, and tyrannies in this book. Also, some discussion of kingship and aristocracy, although most of the discussion of kingship and aristocracy occurred at the end of book 3. The main subject that differentiates book 4 from book 3, and that's why I think it is entitled to a different characterization. I think book 3 is more theoretical, and book 4 is probably, I would consider, the most practical book in the politics. And as I mentioned in our last discussion on book 3, Aristotle has to praise kingship and aristocracy because they are based on virtue, which is the human excellence. But I actually think that for Aristotle, the great distinction in virtue that you would require for kingship to be legitimate. And kingship's even problematic because only one person still gets to rule, and aristocracy is problematic even if it's the rule of the best and the virtuous, so for the good of all. I mean, the problem with those regimes is ultimately they exclude the mass of the polis from ruling. And one of the lessons from book 1 and throughout is that human being isn't just sitting contemplating your navel in a cave or in the upstairs bedroom of your parents' house. Political philosophy is an activity, and human life is an activity. It's as we saw from Sachs's translation of the Ethics, it's an energeia, an inaction. And if you don't have access to rule, it's having reason is what enables you to rule yourself consciously, and with the whole key to the ethics. And in the politics, having access to rule in the polis is one of the ways that you get to develop your abilities. So, in that sense, I think, as I made the argument in the last lecture, that Aristotle really thinks the political solution to humanity isn't the rule of philosophers or philosophic kings. It's to take the most permanent divisions in history, in politics and society, the rich and poor, try to create a social class between them, the middle class, which he comes back to several times in book 4, and to create the regime called polity. I think polity, and remember, as he points out in this book, and as I pointed out, the name of this kind of regime, the least good of the good regimes, the one based on law, and if you look on my chartograph, it really is the mean between two extremes of oligarchy and democracy, which are the less bad of the 3 bad regimes. I think that's really Aristotle's political solution for humanity. And so what we'll do is I'm going to, in this discussion, go over some of the elaboration of the elements of a regime. That's especially in chapters 1 through 3, and then and also some of the other, because in addition to elaborating the definition, he also adds the question of social grouping or economic elements in a much more nuanced and descriptive sense than Plato's lower class, the erotic class in the Republic, which is just everybody that works for a living who isn't a soldier or a philosopher. Aristotle suggests, as you'll see, that I think that the elements of the polis, which is a multitude of different human beings, self-sufficient, meaning that basically everything that human life needs is provided in the polis. And that doesn't mean you can't have trade with other cities and this kind of stuff, but generally speaking, once you have that diversity of human beings so that you have different kinds of professions and everything, and you'll see that's what Aristotle is disguising here. I think it comes, and I'll make this point later on, in fact the last point in this discussion, is Aristotle seems to anticipate the American regime, and especially two authors on the American regime, which I taught also many times, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and I'll explain that when we come back to it, and also James Madison and Federalist 10. So, and then we'll talk about the different kinds of democracy, the different kinds of oligarchy, the different kinds of tyranny, and we'll spend the bulk of our discussion on what I think is the main topic of Book 4, which is polity, regime, constitution. That one constitution that bears the name of the whole phenomenon of constitution, which is constitutionality, constitutionness embodied in a form. And so let's, he kind of sums up and gives a nice definition of the regime, somewhat more elaborate one. And even later on in this book, he says, for the regime is a way of life. Remember, in our last discussion, I suggested that the full discussion of the full nature of the regime becomes clear in Book 3 and Book 4, for that matter. It's a unity in ideas. It's a set of governing institutions that put certain people in power. It's a certain set of laws and policies, and you'll see that's elaborated in this definition I'm about to read. And then later on in Book 4, he says the regime is also a way of life. So those are the 4 parts or elements of the regime that we discussed in the last discussion. Here's his more elaborate definition. And it is with the same prudence that one should try, this is on page 119, roughly 1289a 12 and following, to see, and it is with this same prudence that one should see both what laws are best and what is fitting for each of the regimes. For laws would be enacted, and in fact are enacted with a view to the regime, and not just regimes with a view to the laws. For a regime is an arrangement in cities connected with the offices, establishing the manner in which they have been distributed, what the authoritative element of the regime is, and what the end or partnership is in each case. And there are distinct laws among the things that are indicative of the regime, those in accordance with which the rulers must rule and guard against those transgressing them. So, so the idea that the third element of the regime is its laws and actions, policies, is based in this text, and then the idea that the fourth element, the sociological element, is the way of life and kind of human being that is actually shaped by living in the regime. He says later on in the last chapters that the regime is a way of life and it shapes how you live a human life. So the 4 elements of a regime: ideas, institutions, laws and policies, and citizen character and way of life. But in chapters 3 and 4 of this book, Book 4, he goes into other parts of the regime. And again, this is that nuanced discussion. It's not just the productive class or the workers, as Plato kind of groups them all together into the lowest part of the city, the lowest class, the erotic class, but Aristotle suggests here that different kinds of professions and labor and activities shape different kinds of human beings too. Whether you're a farmer or a laborer or a doctor, those are all erotic in Plato's sense, but they actually lead to different experience of life and do contribute to that division of labor and self-sufficiency that both Aristotle and Plato share, that this division of labor and a diversity of human type is what makes the self-sufficiency of the polis possible. And then especially he mentions here, and then comes back in chapter 6 and 11 through 13 to discuss those great economic classes that Madison says in Federalist 10, that generally speaking, most of political life, yes, you have a few rulers and kings and tyrants and popes and all kinds of those things that have spiced up the political history of humanity. But the really big issue is the enduring clash between the rich and the poor. And the reason that modern utopianism appeals to so many people, and socialism and Marxism, is because these modern philosophers, which are actually extensions of the modern assumption of human equality, simple equality, they seem to appeal because Marx claims that, well, I'm going to solve all that. And there's some element to that. I mean, I think Marxism is extremely problematic, and in many of its core conceptual foundations is profoundly mistaken about the nature of human life. But in this respect, solving the problem of the rich and poor is a major thing. And Madison says that at the beginning of Federalist 10 also. So, so the middle class, the rich, poor, and the middle class, we'll come back to this. That's adumbrated in this chapter, in chapters 3 and 4, but also throughout the book in 6, 11, and 13, as I mentioned. And then at the end of book 4 is the closest thing to Aristotle's anticipation of the modern doctrine of separation of powers. That you can take the functions of government and actually group them functionally. Aristotle's is and isn't like Locke, who is the modern formulator of the modern doctrine of separation of powers. Legislative, executive, federative in Locke in the second treatise in chapters 11 and 12. And the Baron de Montesquieu in The Spirit of Laws in 1733, legislative, executive, judicial. Here, Aristotle's discussion of the functions of politics are legislative, deliberative, and adjudicative, which is very much like the modern separation, is an anticipation of it. So let's quickly discuss the kinds of democracy, the kinds of oligarchy, and the kinds of tyranny. And the more important of these discussions is, of course, the different kinds of democracies and oligarchies, since that forms the practical aim of Book 4 and of the politics in general. How to improve politics, again, bearing in mind that Aristotle is not a utopian. There's no final solution. Ugh, that horrible term from the Nazis, Endlösung. Or the Marxist anticipation that once you eliminate private property, that everything's fine and people will smile all the time and wish each other a good day. The kinds of democracy, look in chapter 4. There's the really true and equal free, even if you have rich and poor, if everyone's treated equally before the law, and that's what it says on the frontispiece of the Supreme Court, equal justice under law. And you can say America does or doesn't reach that, of course. You could say wealthy people have more law, better lawyers anyway, than poor people do, but nevertheless, Aristotle says if you can have a society, and he's pointing to polity, as you'll see, really. And there's the legally restrained kind of democracy, which is at least better because at least the multitude acts within the law. And I think he's anticipating the American written Constitution, because Americans do, even if they hate each other, do basically respect the Constitution, and there's something to that. And then he says there's the raw majoritarian kind, where it's just the will of the majority, which is actually a kind of tyranny. And that anticipates Madison's discussion of direct democracy as having no control on the faction of the majority, and the tyranny of the majority. And Aristotle anticipates that in chapter 4 of this book. In terms of oligarchy, kinds and elements and characteristics, mostly it's property qualifications for either office or selecting for office. And he says there are some kind that are based on assessment. And by the way, the British Constitution is partially oligarchic. The House of Lords is based upon inherited hereditary wealth and titles. And there were elements of oligarchy in the written constitutions of the new states in the American Revolution. Many of the states had property qualifications to either vote for or serve in the upper chamber of the legislature, kind of like an imitation of the House of Lords, except a non-noble title one, just a property assessment. And he says, well, and then there are really big assessment ones, and I think probably he would have in mind, if he lived to see it, the Roman Republic, which Rome really wasn't an oligarchy. It called itself an aristocracy, and more about that in just a second. But the Senate in Rome was really the oldest and wealthiest families who really controlled the polity, and then there was the evolution of the Republic with the addition of the tribunes, which were a popular element. He says, and then there's the hereditary kind of oligarchy where the son inherits from the father, just like Polemarchus from Cephalus in the Republic. And in reality, he says, well, he suggests I should say this, the human race politically has, up until the modern times, which is a revolution in equality, basically, was ruled by royal families and aristocracies. But these aristocracies, Aristotle would suggest, were really not the rule of the best. They were by noble birth, but by noble birth, just as I said about the Roman Senate, is they were really inherited wealthy oligarchies. So that dressed themselves up as aristocracies. Whereas if you really looked at, and I think, by the way, Shakespeare, who is I think an opponent of aristocracy, and in the history plays, shows just how fratricidal and self-serving the aristocratic class in England really was. At least that's if you're interested in Shakespeare's politics, which I've taken and taught several classes on, I think that's probably Shakespeare's take, that there's that when you really look at the inner life of the aristocracy and the royal families, you don't see any better human being there than if you walked into Walmart. And except they were probably a little better dressed. Anyway, again, the purpose, I think these two chapters are very important because they're not only just telling you the kinds of democracies and oligarchies, he's helping set up the practical aim of creating a regime which is a blending of both, a mean between of those, and how you blend them. More about that in a bit. And then the kinds of tyrannies in chapter 10. You have legal tyrannies and some willing tyrannies, and then you have just plain bad tyrannies where the guy took over or whoever took over and rules through force and fear and Voldemortian tyranny. So let's finish our discussion with his discussion of an embrace of polity. And on page 130 in chapter 8, you get a nice definition of what polity is. And again, my argument is this is the real theme of Book 4. And what he's really trying to point humanity in the direction of. And he says, by the way, that they're actually, it's easy to kind of formulate idealistically what the polity is, but there haven't been really many of them, which is why most people have either called polities a democracy or oligarchy or even an aristocracy. And I think Aristotle understands that his political science is an attempt to bring something novel into the world and to really make politics, human politics, better. At the risk of being repetitive, again, that's not showing humanity how to be ruled by philosophers or to make kings philosophic, although that might make things better if you had an Abraham Lincoln rather than a Nero or a Caligula or a Stalin or a Joe Dunn. Yes, my department chair, for those of you who are unaware of my life at Converse College. Anyway, so here's a nice definition on page, chapter 8, page 130, and the references is the marginal number note is 1293b32. Simply speaking, polity is a mixture of oligarchy and democracy. It is customary, however, to call polities those sorts of polities which tend towards democracy and those tending more towards oligarchy, aristocracy, on account of the fact that education and good birth particularly accompany those who are better off. Further, those who are well off are held to possess already the things for the sake of which the unjust commit injustice, and so forth. So there it is, the definition. and then and you'll see, by the way, on chapter 9, where this discussion continues, on the bottom 131 and the top of 32, which the marginal note is 1294b 14 and following. How do you mix them? So, okay, that's what polity is. Okay, how do you get from most bad regimes but improvable regimes, democracies and oligarchies? The manner of mixing them is this. This is on the bottom of 131, again at 1294b 11 following. The defining principle of a good mixture of democracy and oligarchy is that, turning the page, it should be possible for the same polity to be spoken of as either a democracy or an oligarchy. And it is clear that it is because the mixture is a fine one that those who speak of it do so in this way. The mean, too, is of this sort. Each of the extremes is revealed in it. So the how, of course, is you take elements of both and mix them. And how do you know when you've blended them? Because it's hard to really classify this. Except the main thing that he says that defines a polity, and remember, each of the 6 regimes can be defined by the number ruling, whether it's for just and unjust for the common good or its own interests. But each one is erects a claim to rule based upon its partial view of human beings. And that is to say, both kingship and aristocracy, as both my chartographs reveals, the one from book 3 and the one I just waved in front of you like a magic carpet, their claim to rule is virtue. They are the most virtuous human beings, therefore they are entitled to rule over the rest of the polis, the rest of the citizens. Tyranny is force and fear, and power, by the way. And let me just say that each of these claims to rule, you should understand that both in book 3 and book 4, there is an element of all of these in politics. I think Aristotle thinks that each of these different claims, virtue, power, wealth, and numbers, each has a partial claim to rightness. And there are times when even in the best regime, you have to resort to force to keep the bad elements of human nature in check. So politics requires force. But unlike Machiavelli, who says that's all it is, all politics is power and channeling power, remember Aristotle says there's also justice. And so you could argue the big difference in human life is between Aristotle and Machiavelli. And of course, that either of those camps is rather large and gets complicated as modernity unfolds. But I think you could say in some ways that that 2,500 years later, that the American regime is probably the regime that most embodies his understanding what polity is. Because even though our Constitution is democratic in the sense that the qualifications for office and voting, I mean, the 26th Amendment says all you have to do is be 18 years old. And the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment and the 26th Amendment and 23rd Amendment pretty much remove any impediments to voting. So basic citizenship in the United States is you have to be born a human being. And then you have to go through the process of legal entry and take a citizenship test, which is actually pretty easy. One of my rabbis was born in Holland and took the test, so it's a little more complicated than being able to write your name out, but it's a pretty simple test, the citizenship test for naturalization. But then ruling office, the judiciary doesn't actually stipulate qualifications. For the House, it's 25 years old, 7 years as a citizen, and live in your state. That's pretty democratic. Anybody who reaches the age of 25 can be a member of the House. The Senate, no property qualifications, no wealth stipulated. You have to be 30 years old, 9 years a citizen, and live in the state. And the presidency, just a natural-born citizen, but 35 years old and live in the U.S. for 14 years before your election. So the written Constitution is actually pretty democratic, as Aristotle would say. Yet everyone knows that we allow differences of wealth and poverty, and there's a wide spread of these things. But when you just check the arrangement of institutions, again, the arrangement of offices, look, our regime is a democratic regime in theory. The Declaration says all men are created equal and free. So the consistent theme of democracy, equality, and freedom that you saw in Book 8 of the Republic, and that Aristotle discusses here. That's so the first layer of our regime is democratic. We believe in human equality. The institutional layer, the arrangement of offices and the structure of power and rule is democratic. The Constitution has no inequalities, human inequalities in it. And even though the first Constitution allowed to or was open to slavery, I should say conventional and therefore unjust slavery, there's no question that Aristotle would have said American slavery based on race was unjust because it was forced, and but then the regime repaired itself by removing those elements, the 13th Amendment and some of the after effects of slavery, the 14th Amendment. Um, uh, the but then the inequalities of wealth. I'm sorry, I was straying. You know, when you're 68 years old and sitting in your parents' upstairs bedroom trying to instruct young human beings into political wisdom. All right. But I think he would say that our political party system, because you could say, well, wait a minute, the Constitution is, and most of the state constitutions and laws are, and the laws, by the way, like our tax system is progressive. That's a democratic feature, where the wealthy, you allow wealthy to exist, but you charge them a higher percentage of their income. So, and the debate in our country, by the way, isn't whether or not you should have, although there are states that have flat taxes, and there have been politicians like the late Herman Cain, who remember in 2016 when he ran for president, 999, 9% flat tax, etc. But generally speaking, most Americans, Republicans and Democrats, are open to progressive taxation. The real debate with them is degree rather than whether or not to have progressive taxes. So taxing the wealthy more percentage-wise is a democratic law. And I think we have a pretty democratic way of life. That's what I was suggesting in my tongue-in-cheek description of Americans as a way of life. But we're an informal nation. We believe in social mobility, and even our language purged the distinction between, as I mentioned in that discussion, formal and familiar you. And so where even the wealthiest people in the world, like the celebrities and the great sports celebrities, when they're not wearing their sports uniforms, they dress like me, slobs, except I even have too high a standard. I actually think that blue jeans are too low class and proletarian, and I, who wear black sweatpants to class and torn shirts and clothes and a black cashmere jacket with elbow pads on it. So whom am I to talk about proletarian blue jeans? But that's become the standard of the world. And so I think probably the American regime does embody this blending. So it's kind of hard to see. Let me finish my thought about the party system. Yeah, it's true. You could say, well, wait a minute. The wealthy have more access to rule because they can run the office and they can pay people to vote and that kind of stuff. And you have to see that our party system was an attempt to democratize access to office, because one of the things parties did was fund and arrange campaigns in office. Like Abraham Lincoln was born a really poor human being. That's not a fable. He really was raised in a log cabin and learned how to read and write from the back of a shovel in front of the fireplace. Dirt poor. And the only reason he could run for office for the Illinois legislature and the Congress in the 1840s was because the party paid his expenses. We've moved to an odd kind of thing because of party reform in the United States in the last 30 years, where we force candidates to raise their own money, but okay, they do that. And even if you looked at the wealth, the economic basis and wealth of the members of the House and Senate, the House is an upper middle class body, and the Senate's a slightly more upper middle class body. But but you should see that in some ways our regime tries to find ways to balance the access and power of the wealthy. let's conclude our discussion of polity by reinforcing what I just said. I actually think that the regime, the American regime, probably is the closest thing that Aristotle had in mind to polity as this balance of oligarchy and democracy. And he anticipates, again, when you go back to this kind of nuanced notion of different elements of the polis, like farmers and merchants and that kind of stuff, two great authors who wrote on the American regime, Alexis de Tocqueville, and this is the base of my American political thought course that I teach, Essentially Democracy in America. De Tocqueville was a French aristocrat, young, born in 1805, and came to this country because in 1831 and traveled here for 9 months and went back to France and wrote a big book on America, the best book on America, because he thought that Europeans only thought of democracy as the French Revolution. And he thought that America was the most stable and decent democracy in the world, not perfect, of course. And interestingly enough, on this question of the middle class, whose instincts are because, well, here, let me use de Tocqueville's discussion of this because I think it highlights and illuminates Aristotle's discussion of the middle class. In Volume 1, Part 2, Chapter 5 of Democracy in America, de Tocqueville lays out this interesting class analysis of human beings. Every society's had the wealthy. What defines the wealthy? They don't have to work to live. The poor, they have to work every day to live. And then the middle class. We'll come back to that in a minute. So in most historical societies, as Aristotle points out, you're never going to have a society where the majority of people are wealthy. Wealth means few, literally. And so as de Tocqueville says, he says, the vast majority of the poor, society is consisted of the vast majority of the poor, and they were poor. And I've traveled in countries, third world countries like Egypt and India in 1990-92, the other way around, and in other third world countries like South Carolina. And there you really see what Aristotle and de Tocqueville mean. The poor are really poor, absolutely poor. And then de Tocqueville says the middle class. Now, in most historical societies, like in modern India, the middle class, when I was there in 1990, it's estimated the middle class was about 10%. Now it's about 20%. So they made real progress. That means, what, like 300 million human beings out of a population of 1 billion. But Aristotle says, what are the instincts of the middle class? What defines them? They have enough that they're not reduced to absolute poverty. They know the rich who don't have to work have enough that their daily life is comfortable. And the middle class has enough wealth that they're comfortable, but unlike the wealthy who are secure in their wealth, typically because their regimes guarantee their wealth, or they have enough and they don't have to worry about it, the middle class are comfortable but insecure. So the middle class are like this middle point, this mean between two extremes of absolute and secure comfort versus insecure poverty. So what the middle class are the comfortable poor. They have to work for a living, especially in America, and that's what de Tocqueville argues, by the way. For the first time, America created a majority middle class society. And people debate all the time whether or not that's being eaten up by oligarchy or shrinking quintiles of wealth. We can debate that. But nevertheless, I think there's some essential truth. So for the first time, America created a society because of the fluidity of property, etc., as we'll see in American political thought, that the vast majority of human beings don't wallow in absolute deprivation as the peasantry did in most historical societies, and the instincts of that class, and Aristotle has pretty much his thumb on this, is they're not revolutionary because they're comfortable enough to feel secure in their society, yet insecure enough that they can't take for granted their wealth. So the instincts of the middle class are to hold on to what they have and not become poor and try to become wealthier. That's America right there. And in Madison, in Federalist 10, the discussion of faction and solving the great tension between the wealthy and the poor. Again, this nuanced discussion of the elements and different kinds of social elements that Aristotle discusses in Book 4 in Chapters 3 and 4, and he comes back to here. Madison suggests that if you have a diversity of economic factions, no one faction will become tyrannical. And that's, of course, and that's why he advocates the huge republic, which Aristotle could never have imagined, by the way. A republic vast and diverse enough to really accumulate, to really make possible a wide variety of economic factions, which means doctors are technically workers, and as are merchants, as are lawyers, as are factory laborers, as are dishwashers. But their labor and their profession shape the way they view themselves. Take like a political issue in the United States, whether or not to put legal limits on malpractice awards. Turns out doctors and lawyers have a profoundly different experience of that issue. Doctors want to put limits on malpractice awards so that their expenses are less. Lawyers don't want to put limits on malpractice because lawyers earn a percentage of their income from their clients' rewards. So even though they would both fit into the same class as Plato would describe them, doctors and lawyers have a pretty different view of political issues and political life. And I think that's the insight that Aristotle has captured in Book 4. So in trying to see what he understands polity to be, both in terms of the definition of it and the blending of it, the institutional blending of it, and the different legal aspects. And that points, by the way, to the other thing that probably would make America resonate as his example. The claim to human life that rules in a polity is laws. And because laws are a generality and they can allow different interests to exist under the same general principle, found out by reason. So in a way, even though kingship and aristocracy looks good, because it's the rule of the virtuous based on their virtue, polity is that arrangement of the polis that seems to be most intended by nature. And I think this is Aristotle's teaching. Because in being devoted to the laws, not only does it restrain the passions, but law as a generality found out by reason points to a society in which rationality in some ways is in control. So I think that's his practical teaching in Book 4. And we'll see the rest of his teaching elaborated in the remainder of the Politics when we turn to that in our next lecture.